the most dangerous kind of control, is the one that looks like love. Amy Dunne was not born manipulative, she was designed that way, slowly, carefully, through years of being taught that love is something you earn, not something you receive freely. When a person grows up believing that affection is conditional, that every smile must be performed and every flaw must be hidden, they don't just chase perfection, they become imprisoned by it. Perfection is not a goal, it is a contract, and the cost of breaking that contract is rejection, abandonment, invisibility. So Amy learns early on that being loved is not about being real, it is about being right, right enough, perfect enough, desirable enough to never be replaced. This is where the wound begins, not as pain you can see, but as a quiet rewriting of identity, where the self is no longer something you discover but something you construct for others to approve. When love becomes performance, it stops being safe, because safety requires authenticity. Authenticity is the very thing Amy cannot afford, so she builds a version of herself that fits every expectation, every fantasy, every unspoken rule of what a perfect partner should be. But here is the fracture beneath it all: the more perfect she becomes, the less she feels seen, and the less she feels seen, the more she needs control. Control becomes the only way to guarantee that the illusion holds, that the love doesn't disappear, that the story doesn't collapse. This is the psychological trap, where love is no longer about connection, but about management, about scripting outcomes, predicting reactions, shaping another person's behavior so that they never step outside the role you've assigned them. If they do, they threaten the entire system you built to survive. What looks like confidence from the outside is actually fear in disguise, fear of being ordinary, fear of being forgotten, fear that without the performance, there is nothing left worth loving. So Amy doesn't just love, she orchestrates. She calibrates every interaction like a system that must not fail, because failure means facing the truth she has spent her entire life avoiding, that maybe she was never loved for who she is, only for how well she could pretend. That is the quiet devastation at the center of her story. The need to be perfect doesn't create intimacy, it destroys it, replacing warmth with calculation, vulnerability with strategy, until love itself becomes something cold, something controlled, something that must be maintained rather than felt. The most unsettling part is not what Amy does, but why it makes sense. In a world that rewards perfection and punishes imperfection, how many people are quietly doing the same thing, reshaping themselves, managing others, turning love into something safe instead of something real? If love only exists when everything is under control, then was it ever love to begin with? There is a quiet fear that lives beneath the need to be perfect, and it is not the fear of failure, it is the fear of being replaceable. When your identity is built on being everything someone else wants, you begin to understand that there is always someone who can do it better, someone younger, someone easier, someone less complicated. For Amy, this is where love becomes unstable, not because it disappears, but because it can be transferred, redirected, withdrawn at any moment. When love feels that fragile, the mind does not look for connection, it looks for control. Control promises something that love cannot guarantee: certainty, predictability, the illusion that nothing will change unless you allow it to change. This is where her defense mechanisms begin to take shape, not as conscious strategies, but as emotional survival tools. When she senses distance, she does not process it as a normal shift in a relationship, she experiences it as a threat to her entire sense of self. Instead of asking, instead of expressing vulnerability, she reconstructs reality in a way that protects her from feeling powerless. This is projection, where the discomfort inside her is reassigned outward, where doubt becomes accusation, where insecurity becomes evidence that the other person has failed her. If the problem exists outside of her, then she does not have to confront the possibility that she is no longer enough. Alongside projection, there is another layer, something quieter but more dangerous: the need to script emotional outcomes, to anticipate reactions before they happen, to guide conversations in a direction that maintains her sense of control. Unpredictability is intolerable when your entire identity depends on stability. What makes this dynamic so compelling is that it does not feel malicious from the inside. It feels necessary, it feels like protection, like maintaining balance, like ensuring that the relationship does not collapse under the weight of unspoken fears. The paradox is that the more she tries to control the emotional environment, the less authentic it becomes, and the less authentic it becomes, the more disconnected she feels, creating a cycle that feeds itself. Control leads to distance, and distance justifies more control, until the original desire to be loved is buried beneath layers of strategy. This is the inner conflict she cannot escape, because a part of her still longs for something real, something unscripted, something that does not require performance. But that kind of love demands risk, and risk is something she has spent her entire life learning to avoid. So she stands at the center of a relationship that looks stable from the outside but feels hollow from within, constantly adjusting, constantly calculating, constantly asking the same silent question: if I stop controlling everything, will anything remain, or will I finally see that I was never truly loved at all? The deepest conflict inside her is not between right and wrong, but between who she is and who she believes she must be to deserve love. Somewhere along the way, her identity split into two separate selves, one that feels and one that performs. The tragedy is that the performing self became so convincing that it slowly replaced the real one, leaving her with a constant, quiet dissonance that never fully disappears. No matter how perfect the performance is, it never satisfies the part of her that wants to be seen without conditions. This is where her unmet needs begin to surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but as a persistent emptiness that no amount of admiration can fill. Admiration is not the same as acceptance, validation is not the same as understanding. These are the only forms of love she has learned to recognize, so she keeps chasing them, hoping that if she perfects the role just a little more, if she adjusts just a little better, the feeling of being unseen will finally disappear. But it never does. The very act of performing prevents anyone from truly knowing her, and this creates a loop that feeds her inner conflict. The more she is praised, the more isolated she feels, and the more isolated she feels, the more she believes she needs to maintain control. Control becomes the only way to protect the fragile structure she has built around herself. Beneath all of this is a fundamental unmet need from the base of Maslow's hierarchy. The need for unconditional belonging, not the kind that is earned through perfection, but the kind that exists even when you fail, even when you are difficult, even when you are not impressive. Because she has never experienced that kind of acceptance, she does not know how to trust it. What we often see as calculated behavior is actually the result of someone trying to solve an emotional equation that has no solution. How do you guarantee love in a world where love has always felt conditional? How do you relax into connection when every past experience has taught you that connection can be withdrawn without warning? This is the contradiction that defines her. She wants intimacy, but she cannot tolerate the vulnerability it requires. She wants to be understood, but she cannot reveal the parts of herself that feel unworthy. So she remains trapped in a carefully constructed identity that protects her from rejection while simultaneously preventing her from experiencing real connection. Over time, this tension does not fade, it intensifies. Every interaction becomes a test, every moment becomes something to manage, every silence becomes something to interpret. The more she tries to resolve this internal conflict externally, by adjusting the behavior of others, by controlling the narrative of the relationship, the further she moves away from the one thing she actually needs, to believe that she is enough without the performance. Until that belief exists, no amount of control will ever feel like safety, it will only feel like temporary relief from a fear that never truly goes away. There is always a moment when the illusion can no longer hold, not because something dramatic happens on the surface, but because something subtle shifts underneath. For her, that moment does not arrive as a sudden shock, it arrives as a slow realization that the script she has been following is no longer being respected. The person in front of her is no longer responding the way they are supposed to, no longer mirroring the version of her that she carefully constructed. This is where the psychological trigger begins, not in betrayal itself, but in the loss of predictability. Predictability is what exposes the fragility of control, and when control weakens, fear takes its place. A very specific kind of fear, the fear of becoming invisible again. The fear that all the effort, all the perfection, all the performance, was not enough to secure something permanent. This is the point where her perception begins to shift, where love is no longer interpreted as connection, but as instability, something that can turn at any moment, something that cannot be trusted. Once that shift happens, the relationship itself is redefined in her mind, not as a space of mutual presence, but as a system that must be corrected, adjusted, realigned. What makes this trigger so powerful is that it is deeply personal but feels entirely external. Instead of recognizing it as a resurfacing of her old wound, she experiences it as evidence that the other person has failed to uphold their role. This is where cognition and emotion begin to merge into something more rigid, more structured. Feelings are no longer processed organically but are organized into a narrative that justifies action. If the story makes sense, then the pain becomes manageable. The loss of control becomes something she can respond to rather than something she must endure. In this state, ambiguity is no longer tolerated. Uncertainty becomes intolerable. Every small detail starts to carry meaning, every silence becomes a signal, every change in behavior becomes confirmation that something is slipping away. This hyper-awareness does not bring clarity, it amplifies distortion. Once the mind is searching for instability, it will find it everywhere. This is the turning point where she crosses an invisible line, where the goal is no longer to preserve the relationship, but to restore her sense of control within it, regardless of what that requires emotionally. This is what makes the trigger irreversible. It is not about a single event, it is about a shift in interpretation. A moment where she stops asking how to reconnect and starts asking how to regain power. Once that question takes hold, everything that follows becomes shaped by it. From her perspective, this is not escalation, this is correction. This is not destruction, this is stabilization. This is not losing love, this is redefining it into something that cannot be taken away again. In that quiet, almost invisible shift, the entire emotional landscape changes. When control becomes the priority, love is no longer something you feel, it is something you manage. Something you secure. Something you make permanent at any cost. The most unsettling part is that from the inside, it all feels completely justified. To her, this is not the moment she breaks, this is the moment she finally regains control of a world that was beginning to slip out of her hands. The transformation does not happen all at once, it unfolds quietly, almost elegantly, like a system recalibrating itself after detecting a flaw. From her perspective, nothing is breaking, everything is becoming clearer, sharper, more defined. That is what makes this shift so unsettling, because what looks like emotional collapse from the outside feels like precision from within. As if she is finally seeing the relationship without illusion, without naivety, without the vulnerability that once made her dependent on outcomes she could not control. In that clarity, something inside her hardens, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Softness has proven unreliable, and trust has proven fragile, so she replaces them with structure, with intention, with a kind of emotional discipline that no longer allows uncertainty to exist unchecked. This is where the psychological shift becomes irreversible. She is no longer reacting to the relationship, she is redesigning it, piece by piece, narrative by narrative, until every variable is accounted for, every reaction anticipated, every possible deviation corrected before it can destabilize her again. What disappears in this process is not just vulnerability, but spontaneity, warmth, the quiet unpredictability that makes connection feel alive. Those elements require surrender, and surrender is no longer an option for her, not after realizing how easily it can be exploited. Instead of asking how to feel safe within love, she begins to ask how to make love itself safe, how to contain it, define it, control it so completely that it can no longer shift without her consent. This is the moment where her identity fully merges with the role she created. The boundary between who she is and who she performs dissolves entirely. Maintaining the performance is no longer a choice, it is survival. The more she commits to this new structure, the less she can return to anything that resembles her previous self. That self required uncertainty, required hope, required a belief that being real was enough, and that belief no longer exists. It has been replaced instead by a system that values control over connection, certainty over intimacy. There is a version of loneliness that does not come from being alone, but from being surrounded by a reality that never quite touches you. This is the space she exists in now, a carefully structured world where everything behaves as expected, where every reaction fits within the boundaries she has designed. Yet, nothing feels alive because what she has created is not connection, it is containment. And containment does not breathe, it does not evolve, it does not surprise you with moments of warmth or vulnerability. It simply holds everything in place. At first, that stillness feels like relief, like the end of chaos, like the silence after a storm. But over time, that silence begins to change. It becomes heavier, more noticeable, like a room where the air does not move, where every sound feels distant, muted, as if it belongs to someone else. This is the emptiness that follows control, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent. A quiet absence that cannot be filled because it was never meant to be filled by structure in the first place. The most difficult part is that there is no clear way out. The system she has built is functioning exactly as intended. It protects her from unpredictability. It prevents the kind of emotional exposure that once made her feel fragile. But it also removes the possibility of being genuinely affected by another person, because to be affected is to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is something she has systematically eliminated. So, she exists in a state where nothing can truly reach her, not disappointment, not uncertainty, but also not intimacy, not closeness, not the kind of connection that feels effortless and real. In that state, the self becomes quieter, less defined. Identity is shaped through interaction, through being seen, through being responded to in ways that are not controlled. Without that, there is a gradual fading, not of presence, but of depth. She is still there, still functioning, still maintaining everything perfectly, but no longer experiencing herself in a way that feels complete. This is where the emptiness becomes most apparent, not as sadness, but as a lack of something that cannot be easily named. A missing layer of experience that once made life feel textured, unpredictable, alive. What makes this so complex is that she chose this, not consciously, not deliberately, but through a series of decisions driven by the need to feel safe. Now that safety has been achieved, it reveals its hidden cost. Because safety without connection becomes isolation. And isolation, even when it is structured and controlled, still carries the same fundamental absence, the absence of being truly known. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the very thing she built to avoid loneliness has created a different form of it. One that is quieter, more stable, but just as profound. It does not come from being abandoned by others, it comes from being unable to reach them at all. In that distance, even the idea of being understood begins to feel less like a possibility and more like something that belongs to a version of herself that no longer exists. In the end, what lingers is not the image she created, not the control she maintained, but the quiet question that was never answered, the one that existed long before any of this began. Whether she could ever be loved without becoming someone else first. This is the unresolved truth that sits beneath everything. No matter how perfect the system becomes, no matter how stable the outcome appears, it does not erase the original need. It only delays it, reshapes it, buries it beneath layers of control that make it harder to recognize but never truly make it disappear. This is where her story leaves us, not with a clear resolution, but with a reflection. The structure she built is not entirely foreign. It is an amplified version of something many people carry in smaller, quieter ways. The instinct to adjust, to perform, to manage how we are perceived so that we can feel secure in a connection that might otherwise feel uncertain. The danger is not in the behavior itself, but in how easily it can become normalized. How quickly control can start to feel like care. How subtly performance can replace authenticity, until one day, the relationship still exists, the connection still functions, but something essential has been lost. Something that cannot be measured or controlled. That is when we realize the most difficult truth of all, the very thing we try to eliminate, uncertainty, is also what allows love to feel real. Because without it, there is no risk. And without risk, there is no vulnerability. And without vulnerability, there is no true connection, only a version of it that looks convincing enough to maintain but never quite reaches the parts of us that need it most. So the question is not whether control can create stability. It clearly can. The question is, what does it take away in the process? What parts of ourselves do we silence? What parts of others do we reshape? How long can we exist in something that feels safe but does not feel alive? And maybe the most honest question we can ask ourselves is this: if love only feels secure when everything is under control, are we protecting the relationship, or are we protecting ourselves from ever having to be truly seen? What makes this transformation so complex is that it does not feel like loss to her. It feels like resolution, as if she has finally solved the equation that once left her feeling exposed. Now, there are no unanswered questions, no unpredictable outcomes, no emotional risks that have not been accounted for. Beneath this sense of control, there is a quiet absence. Something that cannot be fully eliminated. Because while control can stabilize behavior, it cannot recreate authenticity. It cannot generate the kind of connection that exists without conditions. That is the hidden cost of her transformation. In removing the possibility of being hurt, she has also removed the possibility of being truly seen. Even though she may never fully acknowledge it, that absence lingers, not as a weakness, but as a reminder that the very thing she was trying to protect, her ability to be loved for who she is, has been replaced by something far more stable, far more secure, and far less human. What remains after control has been established is not peace, it is maintenance. A system built on control does not sustain itself naturally. It requires constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance to ensure that nothing drifts out of alignment. Over time, this creates a psychological state that is both stable and exhausting, where everything appears calm on the surface, but underneath there is a continuous, silent effort to keep that calm from collapsing. This is the long-term consequence that is often misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like she has achieved exactly what she wanted, a relationship that does not surprise her, a dynamic where nothing feels out of place, where every reaction fits within the structure she has designed. But internally, something else begins to take shape, a kind of emotional numbness that replaces both anxiety and excitement. Because when unpredictability is removed, so is spontaneity, and without spontaneity, connection loses its depth. It becomes something functional rather than something felt. This is where the cost of control becomes most visible, not in dramatic conflict, but in the quiet absence of genuine emotion. When every outcome is managed, there is no room left for discovery, no room left for vulnerability, no room left for the kind of emotional risk that allows people to truly see each other. Over time, this creates a paradoxical loneliness, where she is no longer afraid of being abandoned but is no longer capable of experiencing closeness in its fullest form. Closeness requires surrender, and surrender is something she has trained herself to avoid at all costs. That avoidance does not feel like fear anymore, it feels like discipline. Like strength. Like control over something that once made her feel powerless. But the longer this state persists, the more it reshapes her emotional landscape. Each time she reinforces control as the solution, she moves further away from the possibility of experiencing love in a different way, a way that does not require constant management. What makes this particularly complex is that there is no clear breaking point, no obvious moment where everything falls apart. Instead, it is a slow stabilization into something that feels secure but lacks depth. Something that prevents pain but also prevents growth. In this state, the original wound is never truly healed. It is simply contained, managed, kept at a distance through structure and control. While this may protect her from the fear that once defined her, it also ensures that the need beneath that fear, the need to be accepted without performance, remains unmet. It exists quietly beneath the surface, not loud enough to disrupt the system but never fully disappearing. Control can create safety, but it cannot create fulfillment. Over time, that distinction becomes impossible to ignore, even if it is never fully acknowledged. There is a reason her story feels uncomfortable to watch, and it is not because it is unfamiliar. It is because it is too familiar in ways we do not like to admit. Beneath the control, beneath the precision, beneath the carefully constructed identity, there is something deeply human, the fear of being left behind. The fear that if we stop trying so hard, we will no longer be chosen. Even if we do not go as far as she does, many of us recognize the quieter versions of the same pattern. The moments where we adjust ourselves just enough to keep someone interested. Where we hold back certain thoughts, soften certain truths, reshape parts of who we are so that we do not disrupt the connection we are afraid to lose. In those moments, love begins to feel less like something we share and more like something we must maintain, something fragile that depends on how well we perform. That is where the loneliness begins, not in being alone, but in not being fully seen. When you are loved for a version of yourself that is not entirely real, the connection never quite reaches you. It stays on the surface, interacting with the image you created rather than the person you are. Over time, that creates a quiet distance that is difficult to explain. From the outside, everything looks fine. Everything appears stable. But internally, there is a sense that something is missing. Something essential that has never quite been acknowledged. This is where the feeling of being misunderstood takes root. Even when someone is close to you, even when they care, there is still a part of you that remains untouched, unrecognized, unseen. The more you try to fix that by adjusting your behavior, by becoming easier to love, the further you move away from the possibility of being understood in the first place. This is the paradox that connects her experience to ours. The more we try to secure love by controlling how we are perceived, the less authentic that love becomes. The less authentic it becomes, the more alone we feel within it. Perhaps the most difficult part to confront is that this pattern often feels justified. It feels like effort, like commitment, like doing what is necessary to make a relationship work. But underneath that effort is often a quiet fear, the fear that if we were truly ourselves, without adjustment, without performance, we might not be enough. That fear does not need to be extreme to shape our behavior. It can exist in small, almost invisible ways, influencing how we speak, how we react, how much of ourselves we allow to be seen. In that sense, her story is not just about control. It is about the cost of trying to avoid abandonment at all costs. When avoiding loss becomes the priority, connection becomes secondary. And when connection becomes secondary, loneliness finds a way to exist even in the presence of someone else.